A Brazilian billionaire has recently blasted the U.S. financial system, picking on the U.S. for its bank failures, which he said any junior analyst in his South America would have detected. But I want to dig even deeper than that. So tell me if this sounds like a safe financial system to you. Between 1980 and 1994, one bank failed every 3 days. From 2008 to 2013, in the years following the Great Recession, 465 banks were closed. And in 2022, more than $620 billion in unrealized losses in banks were due to weakened investments. Basically, what you saw with Silicon Valley Bank, for example, bonds that banks basically didn't have the value that they put in anymore because the system changed. We're talking about the U.S. banking system, and I'm not here to play doom and gloom and to say that your bank's going to fail tomorrow and that you're going to lose all your money and you're going to be trading in Fruit Loops and toilet paper. But what I am saying is there's a call for a greater understanding of folks who have never had to realize that maybe their money isn't as safe as they thought. One thing I've seen traveling around the world, when you go to emerging economies, they don't trust their government, they don't trust their financial system, and often for good reason. They have a healthy distrust of authority and of the institutions around them. When you go to the West, people often are fat and happy, or they're complaining about how terrible it is, it's all going to crumble, we are going to be trading in Fruit Loops tomorrow. And what do? They stay living in the same place. They keep their bank account in their local country. They don't really do anything. It's more of just an exercise to complain. Now, let's compare the U.S. banking system with, let's say, that of Austria, where in 1931, Austria's one bank failure that I'm aware of took place on the heels of the Great Depression. If you look up bank failures in Singapore, Google will just say, what are you talking about? Around the world, banks are much more stable. You see far fewer failures, and that's partially because you see far fewer banks, or you see more international banks in markets like the UAE and Singapore that come in, and they are just an extension of a larger international bank. So the world's worst bank, HSBC, or any of the French or Canadian or US banks, or any of the banks, Singaporean banks and Malaysian banks are now expanding all over Asia, the markets that we've talked about. Banks expand, and so obviously, those banks are bringing a different perspective than your local community bank in Texas or something. I want to go through what the Brazilian billionaire said about why he believes the US financial system isn't as safe as you think it is, and I'm going to tell you how you can actually protect yourself, not by having to flee the United States, not by having to convert all your dollars into some other currency, but by taking some practical steps to protect what you have in the wake that countries like the US are starting to wake up to the fact that they have problems too. So here's the Brazilian billionaire. He said any intern would have seen the risk at Silicon Valley Bank. His name is Andres Esteves. He's the co-founder and chairman of Banco PTG Pactual, and he says any junior analyst from Latin America, where many Americans surely would say, they have so many more problems than we do, would have known how to manage the interest rate risk on Silicon Valley Bank's balance sheet in order to avoid its collapse. He was speaking in a meeting in Chile where he said the volatility roiling global markets is a result of 15 years of complacency during near-zero interest rates that led to widespread excesses. And people were caught off guard when rates suddenly spiked and didn't have the real-life experience on how to manage those risks. This is what we've talked about before. You look at some of the younger folks today in society who've never had to live through a recession, and looked what happened with some of the excesses in just the last couple of years. They were trading stocks, they were trading options, they were getting into Bitcoin. Nothing wrong with any of those things. We've worked with a number of clients who their careers as investors took off when they were sitting at home due to COVID, and we've helped many of them move overseas because they started making millions. But many people didn't have that same discipline because they just figured, hey, numbers always go up. They never had to actually see any kind of negative economic consequences. And you can compare that to countries that I mentioned, the emerging economies, where they know, hey, stuff goes wrong sometimes, to Western economies that are long used to saying, Chile, Brazil, of course they have problems, we're so perfect. And yet, for 10 years I've been telling you, Americans, you need a second passport. You need an offshore bank account. Do it legally, follow the rules, but you need some international diversification. And especially in the last few years since COVID, Americans are saying, yeah, you know what we do. In the years since Justin Trudeau took over Canada, hey, Canadians are saying, yeah, we do. We need other options. Australians being locked in or out of their country during a pandemic said, we thought we were citizens with rights. we realize we need other options. And Nomad Capitalist has helped a lot of those people in recent years create holistic plans to say, maybe I just want a plan B. I want to get a bank account. I want to set up a trust. Maybe I want to hire some folks overseas. I want to get a second passport. How do I do that? There's hundreds of ways to do it. Find me the best ways. Don't sell me on the one way you offer, but find out of all the way, help me achieve these 4 objectives out of all the different options. We've helped people put together Plan B. We've also helped people who want to move overseas because they say the U.S. is getting worse. We have bank failures. Our system is not working. The FDIC is not well enough capitalized. Do we think it's literally going to crumble and become a third world tin pot dictatorship? No, we don't. But we realize it's harder for us to live here. It's harder for us to run our business here. And we just don't feel as safe or really as complacent about our money being here. So Nomad Capitalist has helped a lot of people, primarily Westerners from around the world, and our business has grown because more Westerners realize they need other options. They're looking at stats like saying one country had 1 bank failure in like almost a century, and another one had 465 in 5 years. Now, you may not be banking there, but if you don't realize that it has larger consequences on the entire system, Warren Buffett basically described the FDIC as kind of a mutual insurance company. The banks have to put in enough money to kind of help each other out when one goes under, and yet there's not really enough there if you had 1 or 2 major bank failures. It's just not well enough funded. So what do? Do you go to the banks and ask for more money? Well, if they're hurting, that's hard. Do you go to Congress? Well, the precedent's already been set by Janet Yellen. All right, we're going to help out SVB, but don't get used to it, was basically the message. The message was, whenever we're in the mood, we'll help out depositors. And so if you're running a business, and let's say you're planning on doing an acquisition, or you're saving up to buy a house, or you're doing any number of things, you may have well over the FDIC cap. You're not going to have 10 or 20 different bank accounts. You do see a few banks who are saying, all right, we got $3 million now in insurance. We got $5 million. We got sweep accounts. But if you're dealing with large enough amounts of money, you don't want to keep it all in one system. The U.S. has so many banks. I'm sitting here in Serbia at the moment. They have something like 20 banks, and people who come from around Europe are like, why do you have so many banks? Look at this one. The 20th bank is tiny. You don't need it. Most countries don't have so many banks. You've got big, stable, strong banks. In the UAE, for example, where Dubai and Abu Dhabi are, banks are required to be like public companies. They're required to be serious, which is why during the Great Recession, the government of the UAE came in and said, no matter how much money you have in the system, we'll make everybody whole no matter what happens, because they realized they created a better mousetrap. They went around over the years and said, what do the smartest people in the world do to run all of their institutions? Their government actually hires smart people in the UAE. They don't hire political hacks. They hire people with real-world experience that create systems not based on dogma, but based on pragmatism. And therefore, the result is a better mousetrap that then the government can stand behind and say, don't worry, your money's safe here. Contrast that with Janet Yellen and the folks in the U.S. saying, hey, be lucky we stepped in this time, but you're not always going to be so fortunate. And so what are we seeing now? Too many banks in the United States, and just the system has its issues. This is a perfect reason to be banking overseas, because it's not just about if your bank fails. But as I've often said to people who move from California to Florida to save a little bit of money on state taxes, if you're going to move, you might as well move. And it wouldn't be that much harder, rather than going and setting up an account at Chase Bank, to go to a country like Singapore, where all 3 of the top banks are actually in the top 15 strongest banks in the world, according to the people that measure that kind of stuff. Now, you're not just going to walk into those 3 banks off the street the way you would walk into a Chase Bank or a Bank of America branch. You probably, in this day and age, for the best banks, if you don't live there, need to know someone. Nomad Capitalist helps our clients figure out which banks are the best for their needs. How much do you want to put in? Where do you want it to be? Is interest rates important? Do you need to be doing trading? There's so many questions that go into it. We help people do that. But if you could find a way to get an account at Singapore Bank, it's going to cost you in the low 6 figures. Why not go and spend the time, make a little trip out of it, because you do need to go to a place like Singapore. You don't need to go to all the countries, but for some of the stronger ones, you do need to go. Why not make a little trip out of it? And rather than moving your money from one bank in the same country to another bank in the same country, say, let me take this opportunity to give myself some asset protection, particularly if I'm in business. Give myself access to different currencies, because I have access to 12 different currencies in Singapore. And so if I ever think, hey, the dollar, I'm not feeling so good anymore, I can flip over into Singapore dollars or euros or renminbi or anything I want. I'm also going to give myself greater stability because there's really no U.S. bank that anyone watching would be using that's in even the top 50 safest banks. There's banks in the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, in Switzerland, in the UK, all over the world. And then there's smaller jurisdictions. We've talked about places like Georgia. Put $1,000 in there and you've got a bank account that now you can build on. Which one's the best? Well, that's what we help people figure out every day. It's be impossible to go into that on a video. But banking overseas, to me, is the perfect answer to realizing there are cracks in the system. Preferably, I want to do this in a market where they're not complacent. They are saying, how do we make our system stronger? They're actually looking at risks. Part of the reason that you can't really get a bank account 99% of the time anymore in Hong Kong is because the banks there are just too conservative and they have plenty of money. They don't need more money. They need to make sure that they're protecting the money that they have. Do you believe that's how the system runs where you live? If not, then you probably want to switch over to a system for at least part of your money where their goal is conservation rather than building up their own company. So there are banks offshore in places like the Cook Islands where you can put your money in. They don't make loans at all. They just hold your money and they charge you a reasonable monthly fee and it's there and you can hold different currencies. And if you want to buy gold, you probably shouldn't buy gold through a bank, especially if you're an American. But you have access to things that are better, right? What bank in the US isn't loaning out any of your money? What bank in any Western country isn't loaning out any of your money? And so if you keep your money in some of these stronger banks or even the full reserve banks, that you are going to have it when the time comes. It's no different than having different asset classes in your stock portfolio, not putting all your money into one basket. Don't do that for the same country. I walked into a bank in Singapore many years ago, and I still have the account that they opened there. I only had to put in about $800 US to start, and I can still operate the account under those conditions. But if I walk in now as a many-year, decade-long customer of that bank, they don't want to upgrade my account to the fancy account. They don't want to give me new privileges because that bank just doesn't really want foreigners. They only want you if you live in Singapore, and they only want you if you're Singaporean. And so that's an option that used to exist, and we used to send some clients there, and they were happy to serve our clients. Now they changed. And so what Nomad Capitalist does is help people who want to protect their assets. It could be having a bank account. It could mean moving part of your company overseas. Maybe you want to hire overseas for lower cost. You can grow your company faster. Maybe you want a trust or some kind of corporate structure to protect your assets more thoroughly. Those banks are going to be different, right? In jurisdictions like Singapore where trusts aren't very well used, they're not really going to be as comfortable in many cases opening an account for a trust. A bank in Switzerland, for example, or the UK, or one of the more old money European banks will be more familiar with that. But there's going to be generally more hoops to jump through. And their number is not going to be low six figures. Their number might be low seven figures or even mid seven figures to accommodate you. It also depends on where the trust jurisdiction is. I mean, there's so many factors that go into this. But if you are realizing there's cracks in your system and you have a decent amount of money that you're playing with, Nomad Capitalist helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs navigate this whole world where you don't get an ad in the junk mail telling you, hey, open a bank account and we'll give you $50. The banks that you want overseas, they don't need to encourage you. They don't need to bribe you to come in and open an account. They already have plenty of business. That's why they're safe banks. And they'll take you, not all of them, and the number shrinks by the year. But we help people figure out not only where to bank, but an entire system for their money. And I think once you start to move your money out, then you start looking at all the other cracks in the system. Why are we paying such high taxes and not getting anything for it? Why don't I live somewhere else? Why is this passport, why do I have restrictions being in America? Like, maybe I should get a second passport. I mean, to me, you start to see more of the cracks the more you look for them. This is one big one right now. It was called out by a billionaire in Brazil. That's what we've been talking about for a decade.